Wyoming Territory. Winter 1878. A man tears her contract in half on a train platform, then walks away without looking back. 3 hours later, Clara Vance is on her knees in the snow, half dead, pounding on the door of 3 strangers. The door opens. The fire hits her face. And in the dark, 3 voices speak at once. Sleep in our bed. You'll be ours. She's trembling. And it isn't from the cold anymore. This is the story of a woman thrown away in a blizzard, and the 3 men who turned that vow into a shield against the most dangerous land baron in Wyoming Territory. Hit subscribe and don't miss Chapter 1. The train station at Harrow's Creek was barely a station at all. A wooden platform, a rusted bell, and a sign half-eaten by weather. Clara Vance stood on it with a carpet bag at her feet and wind sharp enough to draw blood. She'd ridden 3 days from Boston for this. The contract was folded inside her coat, pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat. 12 pages. Notarized. Her name at the bottom. Her father's debts at the top. The arithmetic of her life reduced to ink and obligation. Vance Sterling was already waiting when she stepped off the train. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, immaculate in a charcoal wool coat that cost more than her father had owed. He looked her over the way a buyer eyes, livestock slow, methodical, unimpressed. Miss Vance. He didn't extend his hand, Mr. Sterling. She did. He ignored it, pulled the contract from his breast pocket instead. And for one absurd moment, Clara thought he meant to review it. Then he tore it in half. The wind took one piece immediately. The other fluttered at her feet. You're smaller than the portrait suggested, he said, and older. I'm 24. As I said, he tucked his gloves back on, finger by deliberate finger. You won't do. I require a woman of more substantial constitution for Wyoming Territory. Someone who can manage a household of scale. He glanced at her carpet bag. You've clearly managed very little. Clara looked at the torn contract on the platform, then at the sky, which had gone the color of iron. You can't simply. I just did. Sterling turned his back on her. The afternoon train east departs in 6 hours. I'd suggest you be on it, Miss Vance. This storm won't negotiate. He walked to a waiting coach without looking back. The driver cracked the reins before the door fully closed. She stood there until the sound of the horses died completely. 6 hours. She did the math. She had 70 cents, a carpet bag, and a ticket already used. She had no wired funds, no contacts, and no name in this territory beyond the one just publicly discarded on a train platform. She picked up her bag and walked into town. The general store manager was sympathetic but firm. The hotel clerk was less sympathetic. The telegraph office was closed until morning. By the time Clara had exhausted her options, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees, and the sky was the particular gray that means it isn't threatening snow anymore. It's simply snowing. She stood at the edge of town and looked at the mountain. One light, high up maybe 3 miles, maybe more, warm and orange against all that white. She started walking. The first mile was hard. The second mile was something beyond hard, a thing she had no word for. The snow came past her knees. Her skirts were soaked through within minutes, heavy as lead, dragging at every step. She stopped counting her breaths and focused on the light. Her father had been a school teacher before he was a gambler. He'd taught her that the body quits long before it has to, that the mind is the last thing to go. She held on to that through the second mile and into the third, when her hands stopped hurting because she could no longer feel them, and the light ahead seemed to get no closer no matter how many steps she took. She fell twice, got up twice. The third time, her legs simply stopped cooperating. She went down on her knees in the snow and stayed there, and the wind was very loud, and the light was still there, steady and orange, impossibly close now. She crawled. The door was heavy oak, dark with age, warm to the touch despite the cold. She pressed her palm flat against it, because she could not make a fist anymore. Then she fell against it, and it opened. Heat hit her like a wall. Firelight, the smell of wood smoke and pine, and something cooking. She was aware of voices. low and male. And then the floor was coming up fast, and she didn't have anything left to stop it. She woke in pieces, warmth first, then pain her hands, her feet, returning to themselves with a ferocity that brought tears before she was fully conscious. Then voices. She's coming around. Slowly. Don't crowd her. I'm not crowding her. Wyatt. I'm standing further. Clara opened her eyes. 3 men, all large in the way of men who work with their hands and have done so for years. The eldest had a scar along his jaw and eyes that had looked at hard things and kept going. The one beside him was leaner, watchful, with the kind of stillness that comes from knowing exactly when to move. The youngest was crouched nearest to her, jaw tight, like he'd been the most afraid, she realized. Then what she was wearing, which was very little. She pulled the buffalo robe up to her chin. Your clothes were frozen solid, the eldest said. His voice was low, deliberate. We didn't have a choice. Who are you? Her voice came out wrong, thin and scraped. Wyatt Hayes. He nodded left. Cole. Right. Emmett. This is our land. She processed that. You undressed me. We saved your life, the one called Cole said. No apology in it, but no cruelty either. Just the plain shape of fact. The fire crackled. Outside, the storm had built itself into something enormous. She could hear it testing the roof, the walls, looking for a way in. Emmett leaned forward. You don't have to be afraid. Not here. She looked at the 3 of them. She had 70 cents and no coat, and a blizzard with her name on it. She looked at Wyatt. Something passed between them that she couldn't have named. He held her gaze steady, the way a man holds a lamp in a doorway, not to own the dark, but to make it smaller. Sleep, Wyatt said quietly. Cole's hand closed over hers. Emmett's warmth pressed at her back, solid and deliberate. 3 voices, low and overlapping, like one sound. Sleep in our bed. You'll be ours, not a claim. A door held open. She slept. Morning came slow and gray through the single cabin window, the glass fogged with cold and breathing. Clara woke before the fire had fully died, which meant she woke to embers and the soft orange glow they threw across rough-hewn log walls. For one blissful, unthinking moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then the smell hit her. Pine smoke, coffee, and the particular damp wool scent of men who live hard in cold country. She turned her head. The cabin was one large room, a kitchen area with a cast-iron stove, a long table scarred from years of use, 3 bedrolls near the far wall, and the one she was in, which was clearly the only actual bed, pushed nearest to the fireplace. She had been given the best spot in the house. She understood immediately that this was not an accident. Wyatt was at the stove. His back was to her, and he moved with the economical precision of someone who has made the same breakfast 1,000 mornings and sees no reason to make it interesting. Cole sat at the table, cleaning a revolver, each piece laid out in exact order on a square of cloth. Emmett was nowhere inside. She could hear him through the wall. The rhythmic thud of an axe splitting wood, steady, patient, like a heartbeat. Nobody spoke to her immediately. Nobody rushed to her bedside to ask how she felt or comment on the dramatic events of the previous night. There was something almost deliberate in that restraint, as if they understood, without discussing it, that what she needed most was to wake up without being watched. She sat up slowly. Her hands were bandaged. She hadn't noticed that the night before. Someone had wrapped her fingers in clean cloth strips, her feet too. She discovered when she shifted. The bandages smelled faintly of something medicinal, a dried herb she couldn't name. Calendula, Wyatt said, without turning around. Good for frostbite. Emmett grows it in the south-facing window. Don't ask him why he started. He won't give you a straight answer. Clara looked at the south-facing window. Sure enough, a small clay pot on the sill, green against the white outside. Thank you, she said. Coffee's on. That was it. That was breakfast conversation with Wyatt Hayes. She appreciated it more than she would have appreciated a long, careful speech about her well-being. He handed her a tin cup when she made her way, carefully, to the table. The coffee was black and brutal, and the best thing she had ever tasted. She wrapped her bandaged hands around the cup and let the warmth travel up her arms. Cole set a piece of the revolver down and looked at her directly for the first time. He had sharp eyes, the kind that file everything away. His face gave very little back. "Sterling," he said, "tell me about the contract." "Cole." Wyatt's voice had a particular flatness to it. "She's awake. She's sitting up." Cole didn't look away from Clara. "Tell me about the arrangement." "All of it. From the beginning." So she did. She told them about her father's gambling debts, which had been obscured from her until after his death. When the creditors arrived in a very organized fashion, with very organized paperwork, she told them about the man who had appeared 2 weeks later with what he called an opportunity for settlement, a mail order arrangement, legally contracted, financially structured to erase the debts entirely upon her arrival and consummation of terms. She told them about the train from Boston. 3 days of watching the country flatten and then rise into mountains, and arriving at Harrow's Creek, to find Vance Sterling looking at her like she was a horse with a broken leg. She told them what he'd said. She kept her voice level. Emmett had come in during the middle of it, stamping snow from his boots. He stood at the door listening, and by the time she reached the part about walking through the blizzard, his jaw was working, like he was chewing on several things he had decided not to say out loud. "The contract," Cole said when she finished. "Do you have the pieces of it?" He destroyed it on the platform. Did he have a copy? He would have filed one. That's standard for any legally notarized. "What about your copy?" "Anything bearing your name." Clara thought. "My carpet bag. I had some documents inside. Correspondence. References. A few bank drafts my father's attorney sent ahead as proof of." She stopped. "Where is my carpet bag?" Emmett crossed the room and retrieved it from near the fire, where it had been set to dry. He placed it on the table in front of her. It looked slightly different. She noticed immediately the stitching on the bottom corner. She had always meant to repair it, and never had. But the shape of it was wrong. Slightly lifted. She looked at Cole. "I found it this morning," he said, without inflection. "Brought it in to dry by the fire. The bottom went soft from the wet. I was checking it hadn't warped." Clara believed maybe 60% of that. She pressed the base of the bag. There was a give to it. A faint, hollow knock that hadn't been there before. She looked at Cole again. He met her gaze. Waiting, she found the seam herself. It was well hidden. A false bottom about an inch deep, lined with oilskin to protect against moisture. She'd never known it was there. The bag had belonged to her father before it was hers. Inside were two things. The first was a set of land deeds, Wyoming territory. 6 parcels, each describing a different section of valley land, each listing an owner's name. She read the names slowly. None of them were Sterling's, but the signature at the bottom of each, the legal signatory, the Eastern citizen whose identity anchored each deed as valid under current territorial law. Clara Vance. Her handwriting, her name, her father's notary seal, borrowed and reproduced with enough precision that even she, looking straight at it, felt a lurch of disorientation. The second item was a packet of bank drafts, substantial amounts, drawn against financial institutions in Boston and New York, authorizing land purchases across the valley, all signed by Clara Vance. A Clara Vance who had clearly been very busy for a woman who'd only just arrived in Wyoming. She put the documents down very carefully, the way you put down something you don't want to drop. The room was very quiet. "He didn't want a bride," Emmett said. He was staring at the deeds. "He wanted a name," Cole said. "A legitimate Eastern female citizen to anchor his land claims. Territorial law requires an established identity for deed transfer at this scale. He couldn't use a local man. Too many people would know him, know his tactics. An unknown woman from Boston, legally contracted, recently arrived." He picked up one of the deeds, paper perfect, and throwing her out in the storm, Wyatt said. "Bury's the witness." Cole set the deed down. "She freezes to death 3 miles from the station. The contract's already destroyed. Sterling's name isn't on any of this. The identity is used and discarded." Clara listened to them work through it in real time. There was something extraordinary about how they did it. No dramatic outrage. No performative fury on her behalf. Just the clean, rapid assembly of facts, one piece at a time. like loading rounds into a chamber. She had been used. She had nearly died for it. And these three men were treating that as a problem to be understood before it was a problem to be solved. She found she preferred that enormously. "He'll know I survived," she said. "The station agent saw me leave. Any number of people in town will have watched me walk toward the mountain." "Yes," Wyatt said, "and he'll come looking." "Yes, so what do we do?" Wyatt poured himself a second cup of coffee, sat down, looked at the documents. "First," he said, "we understand exactly what he's taken. Every parcel, every deed, every dollar signed in your name." He looked at her. "Can you read a financial ledger?" "I taught arithmetic for 4 years. I kept the accounts for my father's household from the time I was 15. Something shifted in Wyatt's expression. Not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. "Then we start there," he said. Cole was already stacking the documents into a neat pile. Emmett was building the fire back up, stoking it with the brisk efficiency of someone who understood that hard work begins with a warm room. Outside, the blizzard had not diminished. Inside, Clara Vance pulled the stack of stolen deeds toward her, found a pencil in the top of her carpet bag, and got to work. She had been discarded like a piece of evidence. She decided to become one instead. The afternoon passed in a long, focused quiet. Clara laid the deeds out in chronological order first, which was the first thing her father's attorney had ever taught her. Dates first. The sequence of events is the spine of any financial story. What she found, once she had the spine, was a story that was genuinely impressive in its ambition and deeply criminal in its execution. Sterling had been acquiring land in the valley for 3 years, but never directly. He used shell arrangements, borrowed identities, fictitious Eastern investors, and at least 2 deceased individuals, whose names he had apparently culled from cemetery records. The Hayes land sat at the geographic center of everything he'd assembled. She looked up from the documents. "He wants this land," she said. Wyatt, who had been sharpening a knife with the patient repetition of a man who finds the task meditative, looked over. "He wants the valley," Clara continued. "Not just the parcels, the whole thing. And your property is the center of it. Without this land, the railroad line can't run a straight path through the range. It would have to arc south, adding," she calculated quickly, 40 miles at minimum, at current construction cost. "That's roughly $60,000 in additional expense." Cole looked up from the rifle he was oiling. "You got that from the deed coordinates and the survey markers on the territorial map on your wall." She nodded toward it. "Whoever drew that knew what they were doing." "Emmett drew it," Cole said. She looked at Emmett, who shrugged one shoulder. "I know this land," he said simply. "Every mile of it." Clara looked back at the documents. $60,000. That was the number Sterling had decided a woman's life was worth less than. She wrote it at the top of a clean page, circled it twice, and kept working. The fire burned low and was stoked again. Someone put a bowl of stew in front of her at some point, and she ate without fully surfacing from the documents, which prompted a short, quiet exchange between Cole and Emmett that she caught only the edges of. "She always liked this. We just met her." Emmett, "Right. But, yes," Cole said, "I think she's always like this." Clara kept her eyes on the page and did not smile. Almost. The documents told one more story. Buried at the bottom of the packet, a smaller deed, different from the others. This one wasn't forged. It was original, and it predated everything else Sterling had assembled. It was a water rights claim. The single creek that ran through the Hayes property fed every other parcel in the valley. Whoever held the water rights held the valley itself. And this document, this original, legal properly filed document, was registered to a man named Thomas Vance. Her father, Clara sat with that for a long time. Her father had been in Wyoming. Her father, who she had believed barely left Boston in his final years, had filed a water rights claim in Wyoming territory. Filed it, and apparently never mentioned it to his daughter. Filed it and left it in a hidden compartment of an old carpet bag. "He knew," she said. The brothers looked at her. "My father knew about Sterling, or suspected. He filed this claim." She held the document up as a counterweight. If anyone ever tried to seize the valley through forged land deeds, they'd still need to negotiate water rights separately. With the Vance estate, she set it down. With me. Cole leaned across the table and read the document without touching it. He left you a weapon, Cole said. He left me a complicated inheritance. She paused, but yes, also a weapon. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. He looked at the water rights claim, and then he looked at Clara. And the thing in his expression this time was something closer to respect, the unguarded kind. She recognized it because it was rare. In her experience, men who gave it freely were rarer still. Sterling tore up the wrong woman's contract, Emmett said. Cole made a sound that, in a less severe man, might have been a laugh. Clara looked at the stack of documents, at the water rights claim on top, at her father's signature, the real one, in the familiar slanted hand that had marked her schoolwork and her birthday letters, and the bottom of every check he'd ever bounced. She thought, you could have just told me. Papa, then she thought, or maybe you knew I'd figure it out. Outside the blizzard howled, and inside the fire burned. And Clara Vance made herself at home in the house of three strangers and began building the legal case that was going to bring Vance Sterling down. She fell asleep at the table, her cheek on her forearm, the pencil still in her hand, and nobody woke her. Emmett put a blanket over her shoulders. She found the door on her fourth morning, not snooping. She wanted to be clear about that, at least in her own mind. She had been looking for the root cellar, which Emmett had mentioned held the preserved winter vegetables, because she had looked at their current meal rotation and concluded that someone needed to introduce the concept of nutritional variety before they all developed scurvy. The root cellar was where Emmett had described it, a flat hatch in the frozen ground just east of the woodpile. But there was a second hatch she hadn't noticed at first, because it was built into the slope of the hill behind the cabin, faced with the same rough timber as the hillside itself, and latched from the inside. From the inside. She stood looking at it for a moment, breath clouding in the cold air. Then she went and found Wyatt. He was at the far fence line checking posts, and when she caught up to him and described what she'd seen, he stopped. He studied the fence post he was holding for a moment, as if it might offer a useful opinion. Then he set it down and walked with her back to the hill. He didn't apologize for not telling her. He didn't make a speech. He simply lifted the latch from a concealed release point she never would have found on her own, and opened the door and said, "Come in." It was a long, low tunnel, maybe 40 feet, shored up with timber and lit at intervals by tin lanterns. Cold, but not brutally so. Dry, the smell was earth and old wood, and faintly, people. At the far end, the tunnel opened into a room. It wasn't small. It had been dug and expanded over years. She could see that in the different shades of earth in the walls. There were 6 narrow bunks along one side, built from the same rough pine as everything else on this property. A small iron stove with a pipe that vented somewhere clever through the hillside. A shelf of provisions, blankets, a water barrel. There were 2 people in the room. A man of about 50, dark-skinned, with a broad, careful face and hands that had done hard labor for decades. He sat on the lowest bunk with a cup of coffee and watched her with the expression of someone who has had to be very good at reading strangers very quickly. Beside him, cross-legged on the bunk, and watching her with bright, assessing eyes, was a boy, maybe 16, light-skinned but not white, with the kind of mixed ancestry that had made his entire existence complicated in any state east of here. Clara stood in the entrance of the room. The man looked past her at Wyatt. "She's all right," Wyatt said. The man looked back at Clara. He was deciding whether to believe that. She understood the decision was not actually about her. Not entirely. It was about the accumulated weight of every other moment he'd had to trust a white stranger's assessment of safety and been wrong. "My name is Clara Vance," she said. "I came here from Boston 4 days ago to be a mail-order bride. The man who contracted me tried to have me killed instead. These 3 men pulled me out of a blizzard." She paused. "I'm not going to pretend that makes us automatically on the same side of everything. but I'm not going to pretend I don't see what this room is. Either. The man was quiet. It's a way station, she said. A safe house. The man looked at Wyatt again. Wyatt said nothing. He was letting her carry it. My name is Josiah, the man said finally. This is my nephew, Daniel. The boy gave her a short nod. Carefully, casual. How long have you been here? She asked. 6 days. Josiah set his coffee down. There's a bounty hunter out of Cheyenne. We needed to let him pass through. Wyatt says maybe 2 more days. Clara looked at the room again. The provision shelf, the careful arrangement of blankets, the stovepipe that vented invisibly through the hillside. Who else knows about this place? She asked. Nobody who shouldn't, Wyatt said. She thought about Sterling, about his land grab, his legal web, his reach across the valley. If he ever found this tunnel, if he found any reason to dig into what the Hayes brothers were actually doing on this isolated mountain property. She looked at Wyatt. This is why you live out here, she said. The isolation isn't about the land. It's to protect this. Wyatt met her gaze. He didn't confirm it with words, but the confirmation was there in his steadiness, in the way he stood in the entrance of a room that represented a serious federal risk and looked completely unbothered by the fact that she now knew about it. How long has this been running? She asked. 7 years. Cole's voice came from behind her. She hadn't heard him come in. He was carrying a crate of supplies. Started during the war. Wyatt ran a different kind of way station then. When the war ended, the need didn't. Emmett appeared behind Cole, ducking through the low tunnel entrance with a practiced ease that said he'd done it 10,000 times. He gave Josiah a nod that had the ease of familiarity. Storm's moving east, Emmett told him. Another day, maybe 2. Josiah nodded. He glanced at Clara once more. You can come in if you want, he said. Long as you're going to be standing there anyway. She came in. She spent most of the morning in the waste station, and what she learned in those hours reorganized her understanding of the 3 men considerably. The operation was Wyatt's architecture, the structure, the planning, the protocols. Anyone who came through received a specific stay length, a specific level of contact with the outside, and specific instructions for their next destination point. He had a list, memorized and never written down, of waypoints between Wyoming and the Canadian border. Cole handled security. He had contacts from his bounty hunting years, men who had crossed to the right side of things eventually, who passed information about which hunters were active and where. He knew the territory the way a chess player knows a board. He didn't think about where people were. He thought about where they were going to be. Emmett knew every foot of the mountain. He was the one who moved people in and out, who knew which trails were visible from the valley and which were not, which creek crossings would show tracks, and which ones the current ran fast enough to mask them. He moved people the way he moved through a forest himself, quietly, efficiently, leaving as little mark as possible. Josiah told her some of this. Daniel told her the rest, talking faster once he decided she was safe, with the pent-up energy of a 16-year-old who'd been staying quiet for 6 days. The boy wanted to be a surveyor. He'd been reading about it. He told her that Emmett's territorial maps were the most accurate he'd ever seen, and he'd spent 3 hours the previous day asking Emmett about his methods. He showed me how to measure elevation using just a stick and the angle of the sun, Daniel said. Did you know you can do that? I did not know that, Clara said honestly. It's called shadow reckoning. It's real old, like ancient old. Emmett says most of the big survey companies have forgotten it because they all just use instruments now. But if you're in terrain where you can't carry instruments, or they get damaged, then you use what you have, Clara said. Daniel looked pleased that she'd understood immediately. She looked across the room at Emmett, who was explaining something to Josiah with his hands, drawing what looked like a trail route in the air. He was patient in his explanations, she noticed. He didn't condescend, but he also didn't skip steps. She thought about what it meant that a hot-tempered, rough-handed Wyoming man had built the most sophisticated covert transport operation she'd ever seen, and had spent the morning teaching a runaway boy celestial surveying techniques. She thought about what it meant that she found all of that entirely natural. In the afternoon, Wyatt took her to the cabin and handed her a gun. Not offered it. Handed it, set it in her palm, and waited for her hands to close around it. It was a heavy revolver, and her bandaged fingers adjusted around the grip carefully. She knew what a gun was. She had never held one. "I'm going to teach you to fire this," Wyatt said. "All right, I'm not going to tell you. It's for your protection, in case things get dangerous," he said. "Things are already dangerous. This is for your protection starting today." She looked at him. "Out here," he said, "you pull your own weight and protect your own life, just like any man." He said it without any particular gravity, without the tone of someone making a grand statement about gender or equality. He said it the way you tell someone what the weather is. "It's cold out. Bring a coat." It was the most radical thing anyone had ever said to her. They went outside into the thin winter light. He stood beside her and talked her through the mechanics first. No live ammunition until she understood the mechanism. She repeated the loading sequence 4 times until her hands did it without her thinking about it. He corrected her grip once, briefly, and when she corrected it again on her own on the next try, he said good and moved on. "The first shot went wide. Left shoulder is dropping," he said. "Keep it level." The second went closer. "Slow your breathing." The third hit what she was aiming at. The tin can 30 feet away rang like a bell. Spun, fell off the fence post, landed in the snow. She stood there for a moment with the gun still raised. "Again," Wyatt said. She shot the next 4 in a row. She lowered the gun. Her ears were ringing, and her hands were trembling slightly from the recoil. And something in her face must have shown the raw, slightly astonished feeling of having just done something she had been told, implicitly and explicitly, her entire life that she was not built for. Wyatt looked at her with that almost smile. "You've got a good eye," he said. "My father used to say I had a good eye for numbers." "Same principle," he said. "You're measuring distance, predicting movement, accounting for variables." He took the revolver from her when she handed it back. "Your father was right about the numbers. He just didn't know the rest of it yet." She thought about her father, about the water rights claim in the hidden compartment of a carpet bag, about a man who had left his daughter a weapon she didn't know she had. Maybe he knew more than she'd given him credit for. Wyatt was already walking back toward the cabin. She followed, rubbing her hands together against the cold, feeling the slight ache in her palms from the grip, feeling also something considerably harder to name, a new solidity, a sense of occupation in her own body that hadn't been there before. She had a good eye, apparently. She planned to use it. By the end of the first week, she had reorganized their winter rations. She hadn't asked permission. She had simply looked at what they had, looked at what they were eating, and identified the gap between those two things with the same methodical attention she'd brought to Sterling's documents. The gap was significant. They had enough food for 3 large men through a long winter. They did not have enough variety to prevent nutritional decline, and they had been storing several items in ways that accelerated spoilage. The dried beans were in an unsealed barrel near enough to the exterior wall that the temperature fluctuation was compromising them. The salt pork was stacked with insufficient air circulation. The cornmeal had a moisture problem that was going to become a mold problem within the month. She reorganized everything, sealed what needed sealing, rotated the stores in the order they should be consumed, drew up a meal rotation that used what they had in a sequence that minimized waste and maximized caloric efficiency through the coldest part of winter. She left the list on the table. Nobody said anything about it directly. But over the following days, she noticed the rotation was being followed precisely. The second thing she did was map Sterling's financial trail. She had the forged deeds, the bank drafts, and the water rights claim. She had a sharp memory and 4 years of teaching arithmetic to students ranging from willing to actively obstructive, which had given her a very good understanding of how to explain complex information in clear sequences. She built the map on a large piece of butcher paper she found at the back of a shelf, columns for each parcel, rows for dates, Notation for the financial institutions involved. Arrows indicating the flow of signed authority. In the center, she placed the Hayes property, circled in red, with the water rights claim connected to it by a line that she labeled clearly. Legitimately filed. Legal. Ours. She hung it on the wall next to Emmett's territorial map. Cole looked at it for a long time when he came in from the cold one morning. Standing in the center of the room in his coat and hat, dripping snowmelt on the floorboards. "You used my color system," he said. She looked at the map on the wall. The territorial map had used red to mark hazards, black for roots, blue for water. She had done the same thing, unconsciously, with the financial map. Red for Sterling's holdings, black for the transactional lines, blue for the water rights. "I suppose I did," she said. Cole looked at her, and there was something in his expression that she couldn't quite categorize. It was appreciative, but not the soft kind, the sharper kind. The kind that comes from someone who has spent a long time working alone and is unexpectedly finding that someone else thinks in the same language, he said. Sterling filed through a bank in Denver for the northern parcels. There'll be a corresponding record. I'd already noted that. We need someone who can access Denver records without alerting Sterling's contacts there. I know a man in Denver. Can he be trusted? Cole picked up his coffee. More than most. That isn't an answer. He almost smiled. Yes, he can be trusted. She made a notation on the map. Cole watched her do it and didn't say anything. And the silence between them was a comfortable one. The silence of two people who are working on this problem and don't need to fill the air. The afternoons had developed a pattern, and she hadn't engineered it deliberately. But she wasn't surprised when it emerged. After the morning's work, the records, the rations, the ongoing business of a mountain property in winter, the energy of the cabin shifted. The hours between early afternoon and dark were for different things. Maintenance, preparation, the slower, more physical labor of surviving well, rather than just surviving. Cole found her those afternoons, not always in a planned way. He would simply appear beside her when she was near the table, and without preamble, without the elaborate social machinery she'd been raised to expect between men and women. He would say something like, "Come outside. I want to show you the Winchester." And she would go. The Winchester was different from the revolver. Longer, heavier, with a different logic to it. Where the revolver was close work, a decision made fast. In confined space, the rifle was about distance, patience. The careful calculation of factors that would change between the moment you decided and the moment the bullet arrived. "Wind direction," Cole said. He stood behind her, close enough that she could hear him clearly, one hand briefly adjusting the position of her left elbow. "Always wind direction first, then distance, then your own breathing. In that order. In that order. The wind is the only factor you can't control. Learn it first. Work around it. Distance you can measure. Breathing you can slow." He stepped back to give her room. Wind just does what it does. She fired, missed. The can was 20 yards further than yesterday's target. "I can see it pull left," she said. "You see it. The trail, in the snow. When the bullet hits it, it curves left." He was quiet for a moment. "That's wind reading," he said. "Most people take months to develop that." "I've been watching the snow for a week," she said. "It always moves from the northwest in the afternoon, so I adjust right." She adjusted, fired, hit. Cole didn't say anything. He just handed her another round. They did this for an hour, and by the end, she had developed a reliable accuracy at 25 yards in afternoon conditions. Cole told her this matter-of-factly, without flourish, the way you might report a weather reading. And she received it the same way, because she had come to understand that this was the language here. Information delivered without the social coding. Trust shown through the taking of something seriously. She had never been taken seriously by anyone who was also teaching her something. It was a better feeling than she had anticipated. Emmett's afternoons went differently. He found her on the porch one evening when the wind had died and the light was doing that particular winter thing where everything turned amber and impossibly still. He sat down beside her on the top step without comment. pulled a length of rope from his coat pocket, and started working it through his hands. She watched. His hands were very fast. Not showy about it, just efficient. The movements practiced far past the point of thinking about them. A loop here, a pass-through there, a tug, and it was set. He handed her the result. A knot she didn't have a name for, roughly the size of her fist, geometrically precise. "Pull it," he said. She pulled. The knot held absolutely. "What's it called?" "Bowline on a bite. 2 loops, both load-bearing. You use it when you need to haul something heavy, and you can't have the knot fail." He started undoing it, slowly, showing her the structure as it came apart. "Or someone." He gave her a shorter length of rope. "Start with the bowline," he said. "Single loop. It's the father of that one." He talked her through it. His explanations were the opposite of Cole's, where Cole was sparse and directional. Emmett explained the why behind each step. "Cross it this way because if you cross it the other way, the knot inverts under load, and you've got nothing. The loop has to be big enough to pass your fist through, because in the cold, your hands will be bigger when they're gloved. This is the rabbit coming up out of the hole," he said, which was apparently a memory device for the complicated part, and which made her laugh for the first time since Boston. "Rabbit," she repeated. "It works, doesn't it?" She tried the knot, pulled it, felt it hold. "It works," she agreed. He showed her 3 more that evening. The clove hitch, for securing to a post. The square knot, for joining 2 ropes. And one she wouldn't have expected. A Prusik knot, which he said was for climbing, and which had the strange property of gripping tight under tension, but sliding freely when the tension released. "If you ever need to move along a rope quickly," he said, "this is what keeps you alive while doing it." "You say that like it's a reasonable thing to plan for." "Out here," he said, "it's a reasonable thing to plan for." He wasn't wrong. She was learning, in a very concrete way, that out here, the gap between reasonable and unreasonable was drawn differently than she'd been trained to expect. "The branches," he said, gesturing toward the pine trees at the property's edge. He stood up, and she followed. He chose a branch of medium thickness, live wood, with the characteristic snap of it, not dead and crumbling. He broke it with a very specific angle of pressure, not straight across, but torqued to the side, so that the break was distinctive. Splintered inward on one side, clean on the other. "Anyone who knows what to look for will see that," he said. "It doesn't look like wind damage. It doesn't look like an animal. It's deliberate." He showed her the angle again. She tried it on a branch of similar size. Got it on the second try. "Good," he said, with the same uncomplicated approval Wyatt had given her over the revolver. "Now come this way." He led her around the property for the better part of an hour, pointing out the places where a person moving through the tree line would be most likely to cross, where the snow lay deepest and would show the clearest track, where the wind and natural ground movement would disguise signs. "If you're ever out on the snare line and something feels wrong," he said, "you go off trail. You use the branches. You drop your markers." He looked at her steadily. "And you trust us to find them. What do the markers tell you?" "Which direction you went," he said, "that you went deliberately, that you had enough time to do it." He picked up a strand of twine from his coat pocket, different from the rope, thinner. He tied a quick knot she recognized now, the bowline. Then he added something to it, a specific loop through the main knot, doubled back, with a half hitch at the tail. "This says urgent," he said. "This pattern, left anywhere, means don't track slow." She memorized it. She memorized it the way she had memorized her students' names on the first day of a new term, which was to say completely, without needing to write it down, because some information was too important to keep anywhere outside her own head. Emmett handed her a length of twine. "Make it," he said. She did, slow at first, then faster. He watched without impatience. "Again," he said. She did it again, faster this time. "Once more, but don't look at your hands." She did it without looking. Her fingers found the pattern the way her fingers had found piano keys at 7 years old, by repetition until the body knew. It was right. She could feel it before she looked. "Good," Emmett said. He sounded genuinely pleased. it was a different register from the way Wyatt said it, or the way Cole said it. Emmett's pleasure in teaching was visible, unguarded. It came from somewhere real. She thought about Daniel in the way station, learning shadow, reckoning with the same bright engagement. She understood now where Emmett's patience came from. He genuinely believed that knowledge should move between people as freely as it could be made to move. He saw teaching as its own form of protection. If she could read a branch snap and tie the urgent marker, she was harder to erase. She tucked the twine into her coat pocket. The light had gone fully amber and was beginning to redden at the edges. The mountains in the distance were enormous and still, and indifferent to everything happening at their feet, which was either terrifying or steadying, depending on the day. Today, it was steadying. "Thank you," she said. Emmett looked at her sideways. "You already knew most of it," he said. "You just knew it in a different language." She thought about that for a long while after they went back inside, where Wyatt had dinner going, and Cole was back at the table with a financial map, making small notations at the edges. She had spent her entire adult life knowing things: arithmetic, literature, history, the careful maintenance of a household on insufficient funds. She had never once had occasion to find out that the same underlying skill, the measurement of variables, the reading of patterns, the assembly of information into reliable predictions, applied just as precisely to a rifle, a rope, or a trail through snow. She was the same person she'd been in Boston. She was also, somehow, becoming someone her Boston self would not have recognized. She sat down at the table next to Cole and pulled the financial map toward her. "I've been thinking about the Denver bank records," she said. Cole pushed his own notes toward her without looking up. "I've been thinking about them, too. We need the originals, not copies. Sterling will have people who can alter copies." "Agreed. So your contact in Denver would need to acquire them directly from the institution's own records, before Sterling has reason to suspect we're looking. That means soon. That means very soon." She looked at the map. At the center of it, the Hayes property, circled in red. "How soon can you reach him?" Cole finally looked up. "When the storm breaks," he said. "I'll ride out." She nodded. Looked back at the map. Outside, the wind had picked up again. The storm wasn't done with them, but inside the firelight was steady, and the coffee was hot, and she had a map on the wall, a knot in her pocket, and a revolver she could fire with reasonable accuracy at 25 yards. Sterling had thrown her into a blizzard and expected her to disappear. She planned to be the most inconvenient disappearance he'd ever arranged. The blizzard came back on a Tuesday. Clara knew it was Tuesday because she had been marking days on the inside of the pantry door with a piece of charcoal, a habit she'd started in her second week without entirely meaning to. There was something important about knowing the date, when everything else was so thoroughly untethered from the life she'd known before. Tuesday, 11 days since she'd crawled up the mountain. The storm arrived without much ceremony, the way serious things often do. 1 hour the sky was pale and still. The next, the wind was rattling every window in the cabin, and the temperature dropped 10 degrees in the time it took to bring the horses in from the paddock. By nightfall, they were locked in completely, the snow piling against the door, until Emmett had to push hard to open it when he went to check the woodpile. He came back inside, stamping and shaking snow from his hat, and declared that nobody was going anywhere for at least 3 days. Cole looked at Clara. Clara looked at Cole. Wyatt, who was reading near the fire, turned a page. 3 days, Emmett said again, with the satisfaction of a man reporting something he has correctly predicted. "We heard you," Cole said. "I'm just saying. We know what you're saying." This was how they talked to each other. Clara had spent 11 days learning the rhythms of it, the way Cole and Emmett circled each other, trading barbs with the casual efficiency of people who have been doing it so long they don't need to aim. The way Wyatt could silence the room with nothing more than the quality of his attention. The way all three of them deferred to each other in their own specific domains, Wyatt on decisions, Cole on threat assessment, Emmett on the land and everything living on it, and how that deference never needed to be stated, because it had long ago calcified into simple fact. She had studied them the way she used to study her most complicated students, looking for the structure underneath the behavior. What she found, the more she looked, was three men who had built their entire existence around the protection of others. The way station, the horses, each other, the land. Anyone who found themselves on the mountain in trouble, they protected without ceremony, without requiring gratitude, without keeping visible score. She had grown up watching men perform generosity for an audience. She had never watched men simply live it. 3 days. Then she found them in various configurations over the first day, Wyatt at the table going over supply inventories, which he did with the same focused calm he brought to everything. Cole sharpening knives and reorganizing the repair kit for the rifles, a task he accomplished with the particular meditative quality of a man who needs his hands busy while his mind works. Emmett on the floor near the fire, mending a piece of leather tack with a bone needle, humming something formless under his breath. She sat at the table and worked on the financial map for a while. Then, without quite planning it, she closed the ledger and just sat. Wyatt glanced up. "Done for the day?" he asked. "Done with the map," she said. "I've extracted everything I can without the Denver records." She paused. "I've been thinking about something else." "Tell me." This was something specific to Wyatt, she'd noticed. He didn't say, "What is it?" or "Go ahead," or any of the other half-attentive responses she'd learned to expect from men who were mostly waiting for their turn to speak. He said, "Tell me." And he looked at her directly, and he meant it. "My name is on those documents," she said. "Sterling forged them." "Yes, but the forgeries are sophisticated enough that a frontier judge, given the right framing, might find them compelling." She looked at Wyatt. "If he brings a legal case before I bring one, the burden shifts to me to disprove documents bearing my own signature." Wyatt set down the supply list. "He has local law already," Clara continued. "The sheriff in HARROW'S Creek. Coles mentioned him being on Sterling's ledger. If Sterling moves first, he won't," Wyatt said. "How do you know?" "Because he doesn't know what you have." Wyatt leaned back in his chair. "He threw you into a blizzard. He thinks you're dead or running. He's not moving to protect what he's already stolen from a ghost. But when he finds out I survived, then he'll move," Wyatt said, "which means we need to move faster." He paused. "You're not thinking about the map anymore." "No," she admitted. "I'm thinking about what happens after the map. What happens in a courtroom. Have you testified before?" "I taught school. I've been in front of audiences every day for 4 years." She looked at him. "It's not the testimony I'm worried about. It's the water rights claim. It's legitimate, but my father filed it without my knowledge. A defense attorney could argue I'm not the rightful beneficiary." Wyatt thought about that. "Is he right?" he asked. "Legally? No, the estate passes to the surviving heir under territorial law. I'm the surviving heir." She paused. "But legally right and practically right aren't always the same thing in a territory where a man like Sterling has been buying cooperation for years." The fire crackled. Cole had stopped sharpening and was listening, which she knew not because he turned toward her, but because the sound of the whetstone had stopped. "Then we build redundancy," Wyatt said. "What does that mean?" "It means we don't rely on one document. We build a case that requires him to disprove 20 things simultaneously instead of one." He looked at her. "Can your accounting work support that?" "If I had the Denver records and the original filing records from the Territorial Land Office, yes, I could build a case that shows the pattern across years." Judges respond to patterns. Patterns look intentional. Because they are. "Because they are," she agreed. Wyatt nodded once. The decision was clearly made in his mind. She was coming to understand that this was how Wyatt made decisions. He gathered the relevant information, did the analysis silently and quickly, and then the decision was simply present, fully formed, requiring no further deliberation. It should have been unsettling, perhaps, that much certainty in a person. Instead, she found it deeply steadying, the way a fixed point is steadying when everything else is in motion. She got up and poured herself coffee and sat back down. And across the room, Emmett looked up from his mending and caught her eye and smiled at her. brief and warm, and went back to his work. She sat with that smile for a moment and thought about something she had been carefully not thinking about for several days. She was not supposed to be here. She was supposed to be a mail-order bride in a house she didn't choose, building a life on the terms of a contract she'd signed under duress. Instead, she was in a log cabin in a blizzard, with 3 men who had pulled her out of the snow and handed her a gun and taught her how to break branches correctly. And she was building a legal case on stolen butcher paper, while one of them mended a saddle, and one of them reorganized rifle parts. And the eldest one looked at her like her ideas were worth sitting up straighter to receive. She should have been afraid of it. She was aware, distantly, of all the reasons a woman of her era and her upbringing should be afraid of this: the impropriety, the isolation, the violation of every social contract that structured her world. What she actually was, sitting in that chair with the coffee warming her hands while the blizzard pressed against the windows, was home. That was the word that surfaced, quietly and without drama. And once it surfaced, she couldn't make it sink again. The second evening of the storm, they talked. Not in the careful, structured way of the previous day's problem-solving. This was something different. It started when Emmett asked her, with no particular preamble, where she'd grown up, and she told him. And he asked about Boston, which he'd never seen, and she described it: the harbor, the narrow streets, the particular smell of the sea in cold weather. And somehow that pulled Wyatt in, who had been through Boston once in '65 on his way home from the war and had a specific, vivid memory of a bakery on a cobbled street. What did they make? She asked. I don't remember the name of it. Something with apples. I hadn't eaten a real meal in 4 days. He looked at the fire. It was the best thing I've ever had in my life. And I've spent 10 years trying to remember what it was exactly. Apple pandowdy, Clara said. A bakery in that neighborhood makes it. It's very specifically a Boston thing. What's in it? Apples, obviously. Brown sugar, molasses for the deep flavor. Thick pastry on top that you break into the filling partway through baking. So the syrup soaks into it and gets, she stopped, caramelized at the edges. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. That's what it was, he said. The conversation moved from there by its own momentum. Cole talked about his time as a bounty hunter in more detail than she'd heard before. Not the violence of it, specifically, though that was present as negative space. In some of what he said, more the logistics, the tracking, the patience required to follow a cold trail over weeks of terrain. There's a read you develop, he said. He was looking at his coffee, not at her, for whether someone ran in panic or ran with a plan. The pattern of their movement tells you which one it was. Panic is random, covers ground without a goal. A plan has shape, even when it looks like chaos. How do you tell the difference in the field? She asked. Look for the moments of decision. A panicked person keeps moving. A person with a plan stops, studies the terrain, chooses. He glanced at her. You stopped and chose on that mountain. 3 miles in a blizzard. You picked the light. She hadn't known he'd thought about that. I didn't have another option, she said. You had the option to stop, he said simply. Some people do. The fire was the only sound for a moment. Then Emmett said, tell us about the school. So she told them about the school. 3 years in a Boston neighborhood where the children were the sons and daughters of immigrants. Fishermen, laborers, seamstresses, children who came to school hungry and tired, and still managed to astonish her on a regular basis. She told them about the girl who had solved a long division problem at 8 years old by developing her own shortcut method, which turned out to be a technique independently invented by mathematicians, but never taught in the curriculum. She told them about the boy who couldn't read text off a page but could memorize any passage he heard once and recite it back verbatim. What happened to him? Emmett asked. He became an apprentice at a printing press when he finished school, she said. His employer told me later he could hold the layout of an entire page in his head without looking at the type, just from having said it once. Memory as a skill, Wyatt said. Memory is always a skill, she said. It responds to practice. Most people think they have a bad memory when really they just haven't learned to encode information in a way that matches how they actually think, she felt, rather than saw. The three of them absorbing this. What way do you think? Emmett asked. Spatially, she said. I map things. The financial ledger. The land deeds. I can hold all of it in a physical space in my head, like rooms in a building. If I need to find something, I go to the room and look. I do that with terrain, Emmett said immediately. He sat forward slightly. I don't remember a trail like a list of directions. I remember it like a picture from above, the shape of it. That's exactly the same thing, she said. He looked at her, and the expression on his face was the look of someone who has been doing something for years without knowing there was a word for it, and has just heard the word for the first time. They talked until the fire burned very low, and nobody mentioned rebuilding it for a long time, because nobody wanted to be the one to introduce the interruption. At some point, Cole said, quietly, and to no one in particular, I had a partner, 3 years ago. Bounty hunting. Nobody rushed him. He took a job I told him not to take. Cole said, the money was wrong. When money is wrong, it's because the information is wrong. And when the information is wrong, somebody's setting a trap. He paused. He took the job anyway. I found him 3 days later. The fire crackled. I stopped bounty hunting after that, Cole said. Came home. Wyatt looked at his brother with an expression that had years of weight behind it. He didn't say anything. He just looked. And Cole didn't look back. But the look was received anyway. She could see that. I'm sorry, she said. It was 3 years ago. Cole turned his coffee cup in his hands. The point is, I know what it means to read a situation wrong and pay for it. He glanced at her. Sterling read you wrong. He read me as someone who could be thrown away, she said. He read you as someone with no options. Cole said, that's different. She considered that. Someone with no options has nothing to lose, she said slowly. Which means he underestimated what you'd do. With 3 miles of blizzard and a mountain, Cole said. He was right that you had no options. He was wrong about what you'd do without them. The room was quiet again. Wyatt set down his cup and looked at her, and there was nothing managed or restrained in his expression for once. It was open, fully present. You walked 3 miles in a blizzard without knowing what you'd find, he said. That's not desperation. That's courage. There's a difference. She looked at him. She looked at all three of them. And the firelight was doing what firelight does in a room where people have just said true things to each other. It made everything warmer than it had any right to be. She had been sold into a contract. She had been thrown away. She had walked into this cabin half dead and been given warmth and a gun and rope and 3 weeks of being taken seriously. The choice to stay had been building for days. She understood now. What happened in the long hours of that third evening was just the moment it became undeniable. She looked at Wyatt. When the snow thaws, she said, I'm not leaving. Wyatt held her gaze. You're sure, he said. It was barely a question. You pulled your own weight, she said. I intend to do the same. She paused. Besides, you need someone who can read a financial ledger. Emmett's grin broke across his face like something that had been waiting a while. Cole said nothing, but something at the corner of his mouth moved. Wyatt, very deliberately, refilled her coffee cup. It was, she decided, the most eloquent thing she'd ever seen a man do. The spring thaw was still weeks away, but the storm broke, and Sterling moved. Not immediately. He was too careful for that. He let 4 days pass after the storm, long enough that a less attentive person might have taken it for coincidence when the sheriff's deputy appeared at the foot of the mountain road. Cole saw him first through the field glass, a habit he had every clear morning after the blizzard. He came in from the porch without rushing, set the glass on the table, and said, We have a visitor. The tone said everything. Wyatt was at the window in 3 steps. He stood there for a moment, looking out, and what he saw put a very specific stillness in his face. How many? Emmett asked, coming in from the back. 2 horses, Cole said. 1 rider visible. That means 1 in the trees. Clara was already at the financial map. Sterling's moved faster than we expected. He knows I survived. He's not coming himself, Wyatt said. That's important. He sends law. Why does that matter? She asked. Because it means he's trying to keep his hands clean, Cole said. He sends the sheriff's office. It's legal. It's official. He doesn't have to pull a trigger. And if anything goes wrong, he has distance. Cole crossed to the window. He's got Harker's office filing the warrant. Clara turned from the map. What warrant? Wyatt's jaw was set. Horse theft. She stared at him. A hanging offense, Cole said. He's charging you with horse theft. She looked between them. That's what he's using. Not a land dispute. Not land disputes take time, Wyatt said. Courts, filings. Judges who need to review evidence. Horse theft moves fast out here. A warrant clears in days. With a cooperative sheriff, he stopped. He doesn't want us in court. He wants us in a cell or on a rope. Clara looked at the map on the wall. At the Hayes property, circled, in the center of everything, Sterling had assembled. Sterling wasn't moving to protect his fraud. He was moving to remove the people who could prove it. What are we going to do? She asked. Wyatt turned from the window. We don't let them pass the property line. He said it calmly, like he was explaining where they'd store firewood. They prepared without panic, which was something she was learning to recognize as its own kind of competency. Panic was loud and fast and wasted motion. What the three brothers did instead was methodical and quiet and got twice as much accomplished. Wyatt sent Emmett to move the horses from the near paddock to the concealed corral behind the hill. The one visible from the property line would be empty, and an empty paddock was harder to attach a horse theft warrant to. Cole checked every loaded weapon in the cabin and laid out the additional ammunition in organized rows on the table, with the brisk efficiency of a man who knows exactly how much he has and what it costs. Clara stood in the center of all this and made a decision. Give me a position, she said to Cole. He looked at her. I've been shooting for 2 weeks, she said. You said yourself my distance accuracy is reliable. Give me a position. Cole and Wyatt exchanged a look. Not the worried kind. She registered. The assessing kind. Far window, Wyatt said. You cover the tree line. You don't fire unless someone fires first, or unless you give the order, she said. I know, he nodded. She took the Winchester and went to the far window. The deputy appeared at the gate in mid-afternoon, which meant he'd spent the morning somewhere out of sight. Watching, he had a badge that caught the winter light and a rolled document in one hand. And he sat his horse with the artificial confidence of someone who has been told the situation is under control. It was not under control. Cole opened the door and stood on the porch without coming down the steps. The message was clear. He was acknowledging the visitor, not welcoming him. Hayes, the deputy called. That depends on your business, Cole said. I have a warrant from Sheriff Harker for the arrest of Wyatt. Cole and Emmett Hayes on charges of horse theft. The deputy held up the document. I'm instructed to escort you to HARROW'S Creek for processing. Clara watched through the window, in the tree line to the east, 20 yards beyond the gate. She could see the second man now, motionless, rifle across his saddle. She kept the Winchester level and waited. That's a serious charge, Cole said pleasantly, from the porch. Serious charges require a court appearance. Whose horses? Exactly. The deputy consulted his document with a stiffness that told her he wasn't entirely sure of the specifics. Property of the Harrow Valley Cattle Association. 6 head valued. We don't have those horses, Cole said. We've never had those horses. Anyone who says otherwise is lying to you. And you may want to think about who told you to come up here and why. The deputy's jaw tightened. I'm not here to debate the charge. Hayes, I'm here to execute. You're here to execute an order someone gave you, Cole said. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't moved. I'm asking you to think about who gave it and what they stand to gain if we leave this mountain in handcuffs today. There was a silence. The deputy looked at the document. Our paddock is empty, Cole said. Emmett can show you. Every horse on this property is registered with the Territorial Land Office under our deed. You're welcome to check them against whatever description you have. He paused. And while you're doing that, you can tell the man in the tree line that the woman in the cabin window has been shooting a Winchester for 2 weeks and her accuracy at distance has improved considerably. The silence stretched. Clara didn't move. She kept the rifle steady and watched the man in the trees. He didn't raise his weapon. After a long moment, the deputy rolled the document back up. "I'll need to verify the registration," he said carefully. "Of course," Cole said. "Emmett." Emmett came around the side of the cabin with the kind of timed ease that said he'd heard the whole thing and been waiting for his cue. He walked with the deputy to the empty paddock and showed him the registration tags on every post, the Territorial Land Office stamps, every piece of paper in clean and perfect order. The man in the trees had ridden back into them before the inspection was done. An hour later, the deputy rode back down the mountain, warrant in hand and unused. He hadn't arrested anyone. He hadn't found a horse that didn't belong there. He had, by the end of it, the particular look of a man reconsidering who he was working for. Clara lowered the Winchester. Cole came back inside. He looked at her, at the position she'd held, at the tree line she'd covered. "Clean hold," he said. "Never moved." "I thought about what you said," she told him. "Wind first, then distance, then breathing, and afternoon wind from the northwest. I'd adjusted right before he rode up." She set the rifle on the table. "I wasn't going to miss." Cole looked at her for a moment. The sharp, filing look. "No," he said finally. I don't think you were." Sterling's response was not long in coming. 2 days after the warrant failed, the supplies stopped. It was Emmett who identified it first, riding down to check the regular delivery point at the foot of the mountain road, which a general merchant in the next valley had been using all winter. The merchant's sledge had come through the storm season reliably for 3 years. This time, nothing. Emmett went back 3 times over a week. Each time, nothing on the third return. He came into the cabin with snow on his hat and ice on his boots and the expression of a man running careful calculations. "He's blockaded the pass," Emmett said. Wyatt looked up from the table. "Not with men," Emmett said. "Smarter than that. He's got the merchant, and I'd guess the next 2 suppliers in the valley, on his payroll or under his pressure. Nobody's coming up this road voluntarily." Clara looked at the pantry. At the reorganized stores, she'd calculated, would last a well-managed winter. "We have 6 weeks," she said, "at current consumption. For 5 people, Josiah and Daniel, are still in the way station. We have 6 weeks. Possibly 7 if we reduce rations on the protein side and supplement with what Emmett can hunt. 7 weeks until the thaw," Emmett asked. "Approximately." She looked at Wyatt. "It's going to be tight." "We've been tight before," Wyatt said. "Not with this much at stake before," she said. "Josiah and Daniel need to move before the supplies get critical. If we're rationing for 5 people, we should be rationing for 3. The room was quiet. "They can't move yet," Emmett said. "The hunter from Cheyenne hasn't cleared the southern route." "How long? Another week? Maybe 10 days." She did the math again. "Then we hold for 10 days, and then move them. And we manage the stores carefully in the meantime." She looked at Cole. "Is there anything we can do about the supply blockade from our end?" "I can reach my Denver contact another way," Cole said. "Emmett knows a trail the southeast side that doesn't cross the main pass. Longer, harder. But it doesn't go through territory Sterling controls. Can you carry supplies back on that route?" "Not a large load. Enough to extend us another 2 weeks, if we're careful." "Then do it," Wyatt said. Cole nodded. The attack, when it came, was later that same week, not the organized. Legal pressure of the warrant. Something raw. 3 men on horseback, not wearing badges, coming up the road at dusk when the light was flat and deceptive, and long shadows made it hard to judge distance. They didn't announce themselves. The first shot hit the outer wall of the cabin. Clara was at the table and was on her feet before the sound had fully registered. She had the revolver from the belt Cole had made her start wearing 2 days ago, his instruction, delivered without ceremony. "Wear it every day now. You don't get to choose when you need it." And she crossed to the window. Wyatt and Cole were already outside. She could hear them, the quick bark of positions being called between them, in a code that was half words and half shorthand. Emmett came through the back and went to the window beside her. 3 riders, she said, near paddock fence. One near the gate, two flanking. I see them. He looked at her. Stay inside. Cover the gate, man. I can stay inside. Clara, his voice had a weight to it she hadn't heard before. Please. The please was what she heard. She stayed. Through the window she tracked the gate rider, who had dismounted and was using his horse as cover, which was a reasonable tactic against someone who didn't know the specific thing that Cole had taught her about shooting at distance in late afternoon light. Emmett had gone out the back. She tracked the rider. Adjusted right. Wind from the northwest. Afternoon pattern. Consistent with what she knew. Then Cole's voice from the dark, carrying with a clarity that cut through the wind. Last chance to ride down that mountain alive. The gate rider hesitated. She saw it. The slight adjustment of weight. The head turning to locate the voice. She fired over his head. The shot hit the gate post 3 inches above his hand, close enough that she could see him flinch hard from where she stood. She loaded the next round and waited. After a moment that stretched out long and cold, the rider remounted. All 3 of them rode back down the mountain. Clara lowered the revolver. Her hands were entirely steady. She wasn't sure when that had happened. The steadiness, whether it was practice or something further in that practice, had taken her. Wyatt came back inside. He looked at the gate post through the window, at the shot she'd placed, and then at her. She held his gaze. 3 inches, she said. I had a 6-inch margin at that range in this light. I chose 3. He was quiet for a moment. You chose 3, he repeated. I didn't want to miss wide and have him think it was luck. Something crossed Wyatt's face. Something deep and complicated and not at all managed. He crossed the room and put one hand on the side of her face, tilting her head up, and looked at her for a long moment the way you look at something you're trying to fully understand. Then he said, quietly, good shot. And he meant something considerably more than the shot. She knew that. She let herself know it. The morning was clear and very cold. Emmett was up before dawn, the way he always was, moving through the pre-light dark of the cabin, with a quiet she had come to find more comforting than most sounds. Coffee on the stove, wood on the fire, the small, solid rituals of a man who understands that the day needs to be built before it can be lived in. Clara was awake but not moving yet. She lay in the warmth of the buffalo robes and listened to the cabin, settle and breathed, and tried to hold on to the specific quality of the morning. The heavy silence of deep snow and early cold, and everything still waiting to begin. She had been doing that more deliberately lately. Holding moments. She heard Emmett check his rifle, the chamber, the action, the familiar sequence of a man preparing not out of fear, but out of habit, which is ultimately better than fear as a motivator, because habit doesn't falter when the heart rate climbs. You don't have to come, she heard Cole say, from near the door. 3 snare lines and a fence check, Emmett said. I'll be back by mid-morning. Take the north trail. I know which trail to take. Cole, a pause. Take the north trail, Cole said again. Another pause. Shorter this time. Fine, Emmett said. North trail. Clara listened to him leave. The heavy door. The brief intrusion of cold air. The silence that settled back in his wake. She got up. The morning moved through its rhythms. Wyatt came in from checking the way station, with the particular economy of report he used for information he considered important. Josiah and Daniel were ready to move. The southern route was clear according to Cole's intelligence. The question was timing. Tomorrow morning, Cole said. First light. I'll take them myself as far as the river crossing and send them with the directions from there. You'll need to be back before dark, Wyatt said. I know. Clara refilled her coffee and stood at the window, looking at the snow, and ran the supply calculations again in her head. 7 weeks. Sterling's blockade had cost them 10 days of the merchant's regular deliveries. The math had gotten tighter, but it still held if they were careful. She was still running numbers when the sound came. A shot. Single. From the north. Far enough away to be muffled by distance and trees. Close enough to be definitely on their property. The cabin was still for exactly 1 second. Then everyone moved at once. Wyatt had the rifle off the wall. Cole was already at the door. Clara grabbed her coat and the revolver and followed, which nobody argued with because they didn't have time to argue with it. They found him in the snow at the edge of the tree line, about 200 yards north of the cabin, near the second snare line. He was sitting up against a pine tree, which was the first good sign, but his left hand was pressed against his right shoulder, and the snow around him was very red, which was a great deal less good. "I'm all right," Emmett said when they reached him. His voice was controlled but strained, and his jaw was set with the particular angle of a man who is tolerating considerable pain. "You're bleeding through your coat," Clara said. "I'm aware of that." "How many?" Wyatt asked. "One man, Sterling's, I think. Not a badge." He was watching the north fence line. Emmett stopped, breathed carefully. "I saw him before he saw me. Would have been worse if I hadn't." Cole was already moving in a perimeter around the tree line, reading the snow with his eyes down. "He ran," Cole said from 20 feet away, "heading northeast. Not coming back. At least not today." Wyatt crouched in front of Emmett and opened the coat. Clara looked over his shoulder and kept her face neutral. It was bad, not fatal, she assessed, but bad. The bullet had entered the front of the shoulder, which Wyatt confirmed by running his hands carefully over the back and finding no exit wound. "Still inside. We need to move him," she said. "Can you walk?" Wyatt asked Emmett. "I can walk," Emmett said, with more conviction than his color suggested. He could walk, barely. Wyatt took his left side, Clara his right, and they moved back to the cabin in a slow, deliberate progression that took twice as long as usual, and arrived with Emmett noticeably paler than when they'd started. They put him on the bed. The next 3 hours were some of the hardest Clara had passed. She had no training beyond the practical kind that came from running a household with inadequate resources. She'd set broken fingers, treated fevers, managed the various ailments of 30 students over 4 years. But this was different. This was a bullet in a shoulder, and the shoulder was a complicated neighborhood, and the bullet needed to come out. Wyatt knew what to do. He'd done it before. She could see that in the way he assembled the tools without hesitation. Whiskey, clean cloth. The thin-bladed knife from his kit that lived separately from the kitchen knives. A thin metal probe she identified as something a watchmaker or gunsmith might use. His hands were steady. "I need light," he said. She positioned the lanterns. Cole held Emmett's shoulders down, not because Emmett was fighting. He was holding himself very still with the deliberate concentration of someone managing serious pain by focus alone, but because the body will move on its own when pain reaches a certain level, regardless of what the mind instructs it. "Bite on this," Wyatt told Emmett, handing him a leather strap. Emmett took it. He looked at Clara. "Tell me something," he said. His voice was tight. "What?" "Anything. Tell me about Boston." He bit down on the strap. "Go." So she talked. She talked while Wyatt worked, keeping her voice even and her eyes mostly on Emmett's face, checking his color, watching the dilation of his pupils, talking about Boston as if they were sitting on the porch in the amber afternoon light. She told him about the harbor in the early morning when the fishing boats came in, the particular smell of brine and fog, and the sound of the gulls, which was the sound of her entire childhood, compressed into one noise. She told him about the market in the summer, the colors of it, the way the vendors called to each other, and the rhythms of that were almost musical. She was aware of what Wyatt was doing. She kept her voice steady anyway. Emmett's hand found hers at some point and gripped it, and she let him grip it, and she kept talking. "Tell me about the apple pandowdy," he said through his teeth. She talked about the apple pandowdy, the recipe as she knew it, the proportions, the exact sequence of the pastry she'd made it with her mother before her mother died. And she hadn't thought about that recipe in years. And she walked through every step of it while Emmett's hand tightened on hers in waves that she understood were tracking what Wyatt was doing. "Almost," Wyatt said. She talked about the caramel edges, the way the molasses darkened as it cooked, the smell of cinnamon and baked apple filling a kitchen that was usually cold. Cole looked at her over Emmett's head. His expression was something she hadn't seen on him before. open and raw and briefly ungoverned. She kept talking. Then Wyatt said there, and set something on the cloth beside the bed with a quiet clink. And Emmett exhaled through the leather strap with a sound that was more animal than human, and then went entirely still. He hadn't lost consciousness. He was just done managing. Clara held his hand and let him be done. The fever came in the night. She had expected it. Any wound of that depth, in winter conditions, with the time that had passed between the field and the cabin infection, was a near certainty. She and Wyatt had cleaned the wound as thoroughly as they could, packed it with the herbs Emmett himself kept for exactly this purpose, which struck her as heartbreakingly practical, and closed it with stitching she had done herself, talking through it with Wyatt, step by step, his instructions calm and specific. She stayed up. Wyatt relieved her at midnight, and she slept 2 hours on the floor near the fire, then was up again at 2 when the fever spiked, and Emmett started talking without making sense. Cole was there too, sitting on the opposite side of the bed with a wet cloth and a face that was completely closed off except around the eyes. She understood, in the 3 or 4 hours of that night, what it meant to the other two. Not just the threat, not just the injury. What it meant to sit next to the youngest and watch him burn with fever in a cabin at the edge of a blizzard territory, with a land baron cutting off their supplies and a corrupted badge at the bottom of the mountain, and know that the war they were fighting was not against a force you could see clearly from the outside, but a complex economic machine that was patient and well-funded and entirely willing to outlast them. She understood why they'd built the way station, why they lived here, this far from everything, why they'd handed her a gun and a rope and a place at the table without hesitation. They were not hiding from the world. They were building a different one. His temperature is coming down, she said, around 4 in the morning. She had her hand on Emmett's forehead, which was her most reliable instrument. Cole looked up. I can feel it, she said. He's cooler than an hour ago. She watched the thing that happened in Cole's face. When she said that, the way the controlled surface of him shifted for a moment, briefly and completely, and what was underneath was nothing sophisticated, just a brother, terrified, relieved. He looked away quickly. She pretended not to have seen it, because it was not a thing he would want seen. She understood him well enough for that now. Wyatt was asleep in the chair. She let him sleep. He'd been up longest. By 6 in the morning, the fever had broken properly. Emmett was sleeping without the agitated movement of a few hours before. His face slack and exhausted, but his color better. His breathing was even. Clara sat back in the chair beside the bed and looked at her hands, which were steady, which still surprised her. Cole set a cup of coffee on the table at her elbow. He didn't say anything. He went back to his chair and picked up the wet cloth and replaced it on Emmett's forehead with the practiced care of someone who has done this before and hated every time. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. She thought about the moment she'd walked through that heavy oak door in the blizzard. She had been a stranger in crisis, a burden, a liability, a woman with no options, and someone else's signature on a forged deed. She looked around the cabin. The maps on the walls, the organized ammunition on the table, the pantry stores in their careful rotation. Emmett's hands finally unclenched in sleep. She had not come to belong here. She had simply stayed long enough to see that she already did. Outside, first light was building. The sky through the window was turning from black to the deep blue that preceded dawn, and the snow caught it and held it and made the whole world look briefly like something lit from inside. Emmett would need 2 weeks before he could use the shoulder properly. Sterling had lost another man on the mountain and gained nothing. The Denver records were still waiting. She was still here. She sipped the coffee and watched the light change and decided, not for the first time and not for the last, that she was going to finish this. 3 weeks after the bullet came out of Emmett's shoulder, he was back on his feet, not full strength. His reach on the right side was limited, and he tired faster than he would admit, which Clara tracked by watching how he held the axe and how often he switched hands. She said nothing about it directly. She simply adjusted the rotation of chores so that the heaviest lifting landed elsewhere for a while. And if Emmett noticed, he was too grateful to argue. The Denver records had arrived. Cole's contact, a man named Aldous, who Clara gathered had a complicated history with Cole that had resolved into reliable loyalty, had sent a packet via the southeastern trail route that Cole had opened during the blockade. The packet was fat and carefully wrapped in oilskin, and when Clara opened it on the kitchen table, with all three brothers present, what she found confirmed everything she had extrapolated from Sterling's forged documents. 3 years of land acquisitions, 12 financial institutions, 22 shell arrangements across 4 territories. The paper trail of a man who had been very careful for a very long time and had just made his first serious mistake. He filed the water rights counterclaim in Denver, she said, running her finger down a column of records. 2 weeks before he tore up my contract, he was already planning to invalidate the Vance water rights claim as part of consolidating the valley. Can he do that? Emmett asked. Under territorial law, a water rights claim can be contested if the claimant is deceased and the estate is improperly settled. She looked up. He was counting on me being dead. My father's estate would then technically be in limbo, no heir claiming it, no attorney representing it. His counterclaim would go unopposed. But you're not dead, Cole said. I'm very much not dead. She turned back to the records. And I have 14 days from his filing date to respond as the legitimate heir before the counterclaim advances to the next stage. The room went quiet. How many days have passed? Wyatt asked. She had already counted. 11, 3 days. She wrote through the night, which was something she had not done since her worst seasons as a teacher. Those winters, when she'd been grading by candlelight until 2 in the morning, with cold seeping through the school building's inadequate walls. This was different. This had stakes that made her hands move faster. Wyatt sat with her. He didn't work. He just sat, refilling her coffee when it ran low, reading when she was deep in the documents, and present in the room in a way that was not pressure, but its opposite. Once, around midnight, she looked up and found him watching her. What? She said. Nothing. He looked back at his book. That wasn't nothing. He was quiet for a moment. I was thinking that I've seen 3 kinds of courage in my life, he said. Physical, moral, and the third kind, which is sitting down to fight something that should have been larger than you, and simply refusing to accept that it is. He turned a page. You do the third kind the way most people breathe. She looked at him. He kept reading. She went back to the documents, but the words took a minute to come back into focus. By morning, she had a 32-page response to Sterling's water rights counterclaim. She had a timeline, annotated copies of every relevant document, a legal argument built on territorial inheritance law, and an attached financial summary showing the fraudulent pattern of acquisitions that gave the water rights claim its full context. Cole read it in one sitting at the breakfast table while everyone else ate. He read with the same focused stillness he brought to everything, turning pages without comment, occasionally going back to reread a section. When he finished, he set it down. If a federal judge sees this, he said, Sterling is done. A federal judge needs to see it, Clara said. The spring train carries a federal marshal's circuit, Wyatt said. 3 weeks, maybe 4. HARROW'S Creek is on his route. Then we need this document to reach him before he reaches HARROW'S Creek, Clara said, if Sterling gets to the marshal first. He'll have a prepared defense and probably a counter-narrative about forged documents and fraudulent heirship. Aldous, Cole said. Can he get it to the marshal's office directly? He has before. Cole folded the document carefully. I'll write to him today. Clara nodded. She picked up her coffee and drank it, and tried to ignore the exhaustion sitting behind her eyes from a night of no sleep and considerable tension. Emmett put a plate in front of her, eggs and preserved potato, warm and solid. Eat, he said. She ate. The day she was ambushed started like the others. Clear sky, cold but not brutal. The particular brilliant winter light that made the snow surface sparkle and hurt the eyes, if you looked at it directly, without squinting. She had taken to doing the snare line. Check herself on the mornings. Emmett's shoulder was giving him trouble, which he wouldn't volunteer, but which she could read from the set of his jaw over breakfast. She knew the North Trail well by now. Emmett had walked it with her 3 times, pointing out the landmarks, the specific rock formation near the second snare, the way the creek sound changed when you were approaching the property boundary. She had her revolver and the Winchester. She had the twine in her coat pocket from habit, the way Cole carried a folding knife and Wyatt carried the small, worn photograph he'd never explained, but touched every morning without noticing. The first snare had a rabbit, which she reset with the focus and care that Emmett had drilled into her. Reset it wrong, and you warn every animal in the area. Reset it right, and you don't have to come back for 2 days. The second snare was empty. She was crouching to check the trigger mechanism when she heard the snow. Footsteps, not a deer or a rabbit. Those were lighter, more erratic. This was deliberate, measured. The sound of a man who thinks he's moving quietly, but is moving through a foot of heavy snow that makes silence impossible. She was already standing and reaching for the Winchester when the second set of footsteps registered from the other direction, 2 of them. She had maybe 3 seconds of useful choice. She used 2 of them to calculate the geometry, 2 men, approaching from different angles, which meant she was in a closing gap, and one of them to make the decision. She ran, not panicked running. Emmett had told her, a plan has shape, even when it looks like chaos. She ran toward the ravine to the east, which was broken terrain and heavy trees. The kind of ground that slowed men who didn't know it, and that she knew reasonably well from weeks of Emmett's teaching. She didn't make it to the ravine. The third man came out of the trees ahead of her. He was large, expressionless, and holding a rope with the casual confidence of someone who has done this before. She raised the Winchester. I wouldn't, he said. And behind her, she heard the other 2 arrive and felt one of them knock the rifle from her hands with an efficiency that suggested he'd done it specifically because she'd hesitated for half a second. She reached for the revolver. The third man caught her wrist before she cleared leather. His grip was iron. He wasn't angry about it. He was just working, mister. Sterling wants a word, he said. Her free hand was already in her coat pocket. Of course he does, she said. They didn't notice what her fingers were doing in the pocket. They were focused on the weapons, the wrists, the basic arithmetic of 3 to 1. Why would they watch the pocket of a woman they'd already disarmed? She dropped the first piece of twine into the snow as they marched her east. She tied it without looking. The rabbit coming up out of the hole, then the extra loop, doubled back, the half hitch at the tail. Urgent, don't track slow. She let it fall. 20 yards on, she found the edge of the trail where Emmett had showed her the rowan branches. A tap that snapped with that specific inward splintered pattern that didn't look like wind or animal. She stumbled, deliberately, used the lurch forward to grab the branch with both hands before the man behind her caught her arm. She snapped it. He yanked her upright. She had 3 more pieces of twine. She used them all. At the cabin, nobody noticed she was gone until noon, which was when Cole went to check the snare results and found instead the empty trail and the kicked-up snow and the Winchester lying in the drift. He picked up the rifle. He stood very still for a long moment. Then he tracked. Cole could read snow the way Clara read documents. Fast, comprehensive, building toward a conclusion. He found the engagement site, read the 3 men's approach paths, identified the direction they'd taken her. He went 20 yards east and found the first piece of twine. He crouched in the snow and picked it up. He turned it in his hands, looked at the knot, looked at the specific extra loop, the half-hitch tail. He stood up. He was back at the cabin in 4 minutes, moving at a pace that Wyatt clocked from the window while he was still 50 yards out. Wyatt was at the door when Cole reached it. She's fighting back, Cole said. He held up the twine. Look at it. Wyatt looked at the knot. He'd seen Emmett teach her. He knew the pattern. How old is the trail? He asked. 2, maybe 3 hours. Emmett came from the back of the cabin, coat already half on. He'd heard from inside. Show me where you found it, he said. I found the first one 20 yards east of the snare site, Cole said. Moving toward, he stopped. He thought about it. The terrain east of the property. The creek lines. The old mining roads. The Callahan mine, Emmett said. Cole looked at him. It's abandoned, Emmett said. Sterling bought the claim 2 years ago and never operated it. But it's on his deeded territory, right at the edge of the valley acquisition. He was already looking at the map on the wall. Isolated, controlled. If he wants to make something look like an accident, a mine collapse, Wyatt said. Nobody said anything else. They were moving in 90 seconds. Emmett tracked the trail with the focused precision of a man for whom the landscape is a language he speaks natively. He read the branch snaps the way a musician reads notation quickly, comprehensively, looking ahead to what the pattern implied rather than just what it stated in each individual mark. She went left twice, he said, barely slowing. Same branch method, but the angle changed. She was telling us when the trail turned. Cole was on his right, watching the outer perimeter of their path for Sterling's watchers. Wyatt was behind, covering the rear and running the mathematics of the situation with the relentless clarity that was his specific gift. He'll have men at the mine entrance, Wyatt said. How many, Emmett asked, with Clara as leverage. 4 minimum, probably 6. He paused. He won't want witnesses to what he's doing in there, which means the men outside are there to stop anyone from leaving, Cole said, not to hold the mine. Correct. Cole thought about that for the 30 seconds of hard travel it took to reach the ridge above the Callahan mine. Then he thought about it for another moment while he looked down at the valley below, at the dark mouth of the mine entrance cut into the hillside, at the 2 horses tied near the entrance, and the 2 men visible from here. 2 outside, he said. 4 with Sterling inside. You're guessing, Emmett said. I'm estimating from available information, Cole said. 2 men outside means he's not expecting a frontal approach. He thinks we don't know where she is yet. Wyatt crouched at the ridgeline. The wind, he said. Cole listened. The howling was picking up from the west, funneling through the mountain pass and down into the valley, loud and erratic and impossible to see through. He can't hear us coming, Emmett said slowly. And inside the mine, the echo will mask everything, Cole said. He won't know what direction sound is coming from. He looked at Wyatt. We can use that. Wyatt looked at the 2 men near the mine entrance, at the terrain between the ridge and the entrance, at the wind direction, which he tracked the way Clara had described, tracking it first, before anything else, because it was the one factor you couldn't control. Emmett takes the entrance, Wyatt said. Cole, you're with me inside. My shoulder, Emmett started. You're not firing with it, Wyatt said. You're at the entrance. Nobody gets out. Nobody gets in. He met Emmett's eyes. Can you hold the entrance? Emmett thought about his shoulder for exactly 2 seconds. Yes, he said. The mine was dark and cold, and smelled of old iron and something chemical underneath, the residual ghost of old blasting work. Clara sat with her back against the stone wall and listened. Her wrists were tied in front of her, which was an error on their part. Emmett had spent considerable time explaining the difference between hands tied in front and hands tied behind, and why it mattered. Behind your back, you were helpless. In front, you had leverage. She had found the rock 20 minutes after they put her down, not searching for it frantically, methodically, feeling the wall systematically with her bound hands until she found an edge with the right angle, sharp enough, stable enough, set at the right height. She was working on the rope now. Sterling had come in once to look at her. The way you check on something you've stored. He was a controlled man, even in a moment that should have made him less controlled. She found that more frightening than fury would have been. You should have frozen in that blizzard, he said. She looked at him. You should have filed better paperwork. He studied her for a moment. Your legal response has already been sent. She kept her face neutral. She had no way of knowing if Aldous had the documents yet. Yes, she said. He regarded her with the air of a man recalculating. It won't matter, he said finally. A contested claim from a deceased estate, with no living heir to press it. He let the sentence complete itself in the air between them. My father's attorney in Boston knows I came west, she said. He knows the name of the man who contracted me. If I disappear, he'll know exactly where to start looking. It was partially true. The attorney knew she'd left. Whether he'd connect it correctly was another question. But Sterling didn't know that. He looked at her for another moment. The mine is unstable in the western section, he said. A structural failure in these conditions would be entirely consistent with the geological survey. He glanced at the ceiling, at the old shoring timbers that were visibly compromised in the deeper sections. Accidents are sad. He left, she went back to the rock and the rope. The sawing was slow, because she had to keep it quiet, and because the angle was awkward, and because the rope was good rope. The kind Emmett would have approved of technically, thickly braided and slow to give. She worked the most strained section of the binding, the part where the friction would be greatest, and she thought about what Emmett had told her about rope under tension. The rope doesn't fail where it's weakest. It fails where stress concentrates. Find the concentration point, and that's where you work. She worked the concentration point. She heard Sterling's voice from the deeper section of the mine, giving instructions in low tones. What she heard was enough. They were going to bring down the western section and leave. Sterling would be 2 miles from here when it happened, with 4 men who would corroborate his location. She didn't know how long she had. She worked faster. The wind masked their approach completely. Cole and Wyatt came in through the secondary shaft entrance, the one that Emmett had identified on his territorial map years ago as a ventilation cut. It was narrow and required going in at a crouch and moving quietly in a way that took concentration and patience, both of which they had. Inside the mine opened into a main gallery, roughly 10 feet across and 7 feet high at the peak, with timbers set at intervals that had done their job for years and were now beginning to disagree with each other about the arrangement. The ceiling dripped slow, cold water. The floor was hard-packed earth that had frozen in the winter cold. Cole moved ahead. He had no lantern. Neither did Wyatt. Emmett had noted once, in passing, that Cole's eyes adjusted to darkness faster than anyone he'd seen. It was the quality of attention, Emmett had said. He doesn't look for things in the dark. He waits for the dark to give them up. Cole waited. He heard voices from the eastern turn of the gallery. He held up a fist. Wyatt stopped. Cole listened. Sterling. 2 other men, at minimum, and then, separate from those voices, and closer the small, controlled sound of someone doing something deliberate. She was working on something. He moved toward it. The rope gave on the 4th pass of what she thought was the 10th minute, not all at once. It thinned and frayed, and then the last strands separated under a sustained pull that she applied steadily, without jerking, because Emmett had been very specific. Jerk a binding, and you tighten it before you break it. Sustained pressure finds the give. Her hands came free. She was already on her feet when she heard the sound from the western section, the slow, deliberate sound of structural preparation. The kind of thing a man does when he is arranging a scene rather than an accident. She moved to the wall and picked up the rock. It was roughly the size of a brick, jagged on one side, heavy enough. The footstep that came from behind her was very quiet. Not Sterling's men. Wrong direction. From the secondary shaft, which Sterling's men didn't know about. Which meant Clara, Cole's voice, barely above breath. She closed her eyes for 1 second, then opened them. West section, she whispered. Sterling and at least 2 men. They're rigging the supports. A hand on her arm in the dark. Wyatt. She could tell by the size of it, the specific quality of the grip. Can you move? He breathed. Yes. Stay behind me. She kept the rock. What happened next was something she would replay in fragments for years afterward. The way intense experiences break into pieces that don't reassemble in the right order. Cole moved into the western section first, and the howling of the wind outside did exactly what Wyatt had calculated. It created a constant ambient pressure of sound that confused direction inside the stone gallery, so that Sterling's first awareness of another person's presence came from a voice rather than a footfall. Last chance to come out of this quietly. Sterling Cole's voice. From the dark. Clear. Calm. Completely without fear. The click of a hammer being pulled back was the only warning Sterling offered. The first shot hit the gallery wall and threw sparks in the dark, which illuminated, for one brilliant fraction of a second, Sterling near the far support timber, two men flanking him, Cole directly ahead, and Wyatt moving left along the wall. She saw it in that flash the way she saw a map, spatial, complete, the position of every person, the distance between them, the angles. Sterling swung toward where Cole's voice had been. Cole was no longer there. The second shot came from Sterling's right flank, one of his men, firing at a sound. It hit stone. Clara moved. She went right, because in the after flash of the first muzzle flare, she had seen Sterling's position clearly, and she had seen what was 3 feet to his left, the primary support timber for the western section. A large rusted iron fastener attaching it to the ceiling crosspiece. One of Sterling's men had already begun loosening it. If that timber came down, the section came down. She crossed the gallery in the dark, by memory. Sterling was turning. She heard him, heard the shift of his weight, heard the barrel of his weapon moving. She hit him from the side with the full weight of her body and the rock in her hand, which she brought across his forearm with every bit of strength she had. The gun went off into the floor. Sterling went sideways. She felt his balance go and pushed hard, and they both went down. But she had anticipated the fall, and he hadn't, and she was already scrambling free while he was still processing it. Wyatt, she shouted. The crash of the Winchester was deafening in the enclosed stone space. Then a second crash, then a third, and the sound of something heavy hitting the ground. Silence, except for the wind. Sterling was on his hands and knees, breathing hard, his gun somewhere on the ground between them in the dark. She stood over him with the rock. Don't, she said. He heard something in her voice. He stayed very still. Light flooded the gallery from Cole's lantern, which he'd kept in his coat for exactly this moment. He held it up. 2 men on the ground, disarmed. Wyatt standing near the far wall with the Winchester. Sterling on his knees in the dirt. Cole looked at Clara, at the rock in her hand, at Sterling below her. He took in the geometry of it without comment, the way he took everything in. The timber, she said. They were rigging the western support. Cole crossed to it immediately, checked the fastener, and drove it back into position with 3 efficient blows from the butt of his rifle. The ceiling held. Wyatt looked at Sterling. Sterling was looking at Clara with an expression she had not expected. It was not fear. Exactly. It was the look of a man who has just finished revising an assumption that he'd held for too long. You should have stayed in Boston, he said. You should have honored a contract, she said. She lowered the rock. Wyatt came and took Sterling's arm, not roughly, but in a way that communicated exactly how far the conversation had progressed, past Sterling's ability to influence it. Cole secured the other 2 men with an efficiency that said he'd done it many times before and found it largely administrative. She stood in the lantern light in an abandoned mine in Wyoming, with her wrists scraped raw and a brick in her hand. And she was entirely, completely, unreservedly all right. More than all right. She was done. Emmett met them at the entrance. He looked at Clara first, which was the first thing she noticed. Not Sterling, not his brothers. Her, your shoulder, she said, because he was holding his right arm slightly against his body. Held the entrance, he said. It's fine. Emmett, it's fine. Clara, she looked at him for a moment. His jaw was set, and his color was off, and she was going to have a very thorough conversation with him about it later. She nodded. He let out a breath. She walked out into the white winter air, and the howling wind hit her face, and she turned it up toward the sky, and the snow was coming again, just lightly, just the first edge of another front moving through. And it landed on her cheeks and her eyelashes, and was cold and clean and real. Wyatt came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then you tackled him. He was going to shoot you. He was aiming at where I'd been. I didn't know that in the dark. He looked at her profile. You kept the rock, he said. Emmett says always keep a secondary option. Emmett is correct. He paused. You also told us east versus west with 4 words in the dark. I knew you'd understand. You're fast. She glanced at him. All 3 of you are fast when it matters. Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. We've been doing this for 7 years, he said, the way station. The protection work. 3 men. Another pause. It was efficient. It was fine. She waited. It's better with 4, he said. She looked at him then. The scar along his jaw. The gray in his hair at the temples. The expression of a man who has been very careful with words for a very long time and is currently choosing to be less careful. She reached out and took his hand. He looked down at their hands. He closed his fingers around hers. Cole came out of the mine with Sterling and the 2 secured men. Emmett took the other side. They began the march down the mountain road toward HARROW'S Creek, where a jail cell was waiting for 3 men who had just had a very instructive night. Clara walked beside Wyatt in the early dark, with snow on her eyelashes and a scraped wrist and the absolute crystalline certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Spring arrived in Wyoming the way it always does in high country. Not gently, not gradually. One morning, the world was white and locked, and the next there was a sound under everything. A running sound. Water finding itself again after months of ice. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes first. The creek behind the cabin ran brown and fast. Emmett's calendula in the window put out 2 new leaves. Clara noticed the leaves on a Thursday and felt an unreasonable amount of joy about it, which she reported to Emmett, who looked at the plant with the satisfaction of someone receiving confirmation of a long-held position. It always comes back, he said. You say that like you've doubted it. I've doubted it every winter, he said. It comes back anyway. She looked at the plant. That's either very hopeful or very stubborn, she said. Out here, Emmett said. Those are the same thing. The federal marshal arrived on the spring train. His name was Beaumont, and he was a compact, weathered man of about 50, with the particular manner of someone who has been lied to professionally for many years and has developed an extremely accurate instrument for detecting it. He stepped off the train at HARROW'S Creek on a Tuesday morning when the sky was clear and the mountains were beginning to show their rock through the retreating snow. Cole and Clara were waiting on the platform. The packet of documents was in Clara's hand. 32 pages of organized evidence, plus the Denver records, plus Aldous' annotated confirmation of the filing trail, all bound together with the clean efficiency of a woman who had organized other people's chaos her entire professional life and knew exactly what a clear argument looked like. Marshal Beaumont looked at the packet, then at Clara, then at Cole. Hayes, he said, with the tone of someone who has encountered Cole before and found the experience memorable. Marshal, Cole said, this isn't going to be simple, Beaumont said. No, Cole agreed. It's going to be comprehensive. Beaumont took the packet. He read it on the train platform, standing in the spring light, turning pages with the focused attention of someone who knows how to read a legal argument and is doing so properly. Clara waited. Cole waited. A station dog of no particular breed investigated their boots and lost interest. Beaumont turned the last page, looked at the water rights claim. He looked up at Clara. This is your signature, he said, on the forged documents. Reproduced from my father's estate correspondence, she said. The notary seal is also reproduced. I can demonstrate the discrepancy in the seal impression, which has a specific flaw from my father's original stamp, that the reproduction gets wrong in a way consistent with second-generation copying. Beaumont looked at her for a moment. You're a school teacher, he said. Former, she said. Currently, I manage land interests in the Wyoming Territory. The corner of Beaumont's mouth moved slightly. Is Sterling in custody? He asked. HARROW'S Creek Jail, Cole said, along with 2 of his men. His sheriff's contact has been removed from office by the deputy who served us the horse theft warrant. The deputy turned out to have limits. The horse theft charge, dismissed, Cole said. Vacant paddock, full registration documentation. No evidence of any actual horses. He paused. There were no horses. I assumed, Beaumont said dryly. He closed the packet. I'll need to review this formally, he said, and I'll need a court date in Cheyenne for the full proceeding. He looked at Clara. You'll testify. Yes. Sterling will have a defense attorney. A good one. I have 32 pages of organized evidence. The original water rights filing, annotated Denver banking records, and 4 years of arithmetic teaching experience. She met his gaze. I'm not concerned about the attorney. Beaumont looked at her for a long moment. No, he said. I don't suppose you are. The deed transfer happened on a Friday. Clara had spent 3 days in HARROW'S Creek with Marshal Beaumont's office, walking through the documentation, answering questions, watching the legal machinery of territorial justice engage with the specific, well-organized fuel she had provided. It moved faster than she had expected, which Beaumont attributed to the quality of the paperwork. Most evidence I receive is assembled by people who want to prove something, he told her. Yours was assembled by someone who wanted to explain something. There's a difference. I was a teacher, she said. Explanation is the whole job. The water rights counterclaim was dismissed on the 3rd day. The legal basis. Sterling's argument that the estate was unsettled and heirless collapsed entirely on contact with Clara standing in front of a judge, alive and articulate, and holding a 32-page annotated response. The forged deeds were voided on the 4th day. All 22 parcels returned to their falsely named prior states, which meant they reverted to unclaimed territorial land pending proper refiling. On Friday, Clara filed, not for all of it. She had thought about this carefully over many nights in the cabin, worked through the ethics of it, the way she worked through a ledger, looking for the error in the reasoning, checking her own assumptions. She filed for the Hayes Mountain property and the surrounding land they had always worked and held, clear deed, properly registered, in the name of the Hayes homestead, with Clara Vance Hayes listed as co-holder. She filed the water rights claim in the same name. She filed one additional thing, a legal establishment of the way station structure as a protected property under the emerging territorial provisions for charitable operating purposes. A legal shield she had constructed from 3 different regulatory frameworks that Beaumont had identified, not quite believing what she'd built with them. This would protect the operation from most interference, he said, reading it over. From most, she agreed, which is the best any legal instrument can do. He looked at it for another moment. Sterling's Railroad Consortium will contest this, he said. They can contest it, she said. They'll need to disprove 20 separate legal foundations simultaneously while I am alive and in possession of every relevant document. She paused. I'm planning to be alive for quite some time. Beaumont set the document down. Miss Vance, he said. Mrs. Hayes, she said, which was the first time she'd used it aloud, and which landed in the air between them with a quiet firmness that she found she liked very much. Beaumont looked at her over his glasses. Mrs. Hayes, he said, you came out here to be a mail-order bride. I came out here, she said, to settle a debt. I settled it. She rode back to the mountain on Saturday. The trail was different in the thaw, the same trail she'd walked the first night. 3 miles through waist-deep snow in the dark, with frozen hands and a carpetbag, was now a clear path through mud and snowmelt, and the first green things pushing up through the brown ground. A different world. She rode it differently, too. She knew where the creek crossed the trail and that her horse would hesitate at it. She knew the stand of pines at the halfway point that Emmett had used to teach her about tracking direction by the way the branches grew. She knew where the north trail split from the main one and which to take depending on weather. She knew this mountain. The cabin was in view when she saw them, all 3, on the porch, which meant they'd heard the horse some time ago and had come out to wait without making a production of it. Wyatt leaning against the post, Cole with his arms crossed, watching the trail. Emmett on the top step. Wait forward. She rode up and dismounted. Nobody said anything immediately. She tied the horse, walked to the porch steps. She looked at them, all 3, the specific landscape of them, which she had come to know so thoroughly over these months that she could read them the way she could read weather or water or the pattern in a financial ledger. Wyatt who made decisions with quiet certainty and expressed care through presence. Cole, who spoke rarely and precisely and showed trust through the transfer of information. Emmett, who taught because he believed knowledge between people was itself a form of protection. She pulled the deed from her coat, held it up. "It's done," she said. "Sterling's in federal custody. The deeds are voided. The water rights are ours." She looked at Wyatt. All of it, including the legal protection for the way station. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. He looked at the document. "You filed the way station protections," he said. 3 regulatory frameworks, overlapping. Beaumont said it would hold against most challenges. Cole looked at her. Most. Most is better than none," she said, "and I'm going to keep improving it." Emmett was grinning. The full and unguarded kind that she'd come to understand was his specific register for things that mattered to him most. She climbed the 2 steps to the porch. She stood in front of all 3 of them, in the spring light, with the deed in her hand, and the mountain behind her and the sound of the creek, running free somewhere below. She looked at Wyatt first, then Cole, then Emmett. "I have something to say," she said. Wyatt held her gaze. The almost smile was there, the one she'd learned to read as his nearest equivalent to open happiness. She reached out and pulled them in, one arm around Wyatt, the other reaching for Cole's sleeve, until the distance between all 4 of them was nothing. And the warmth of it was the same warmth as that first night, the same buffalo robe warmth, except now it was a choice freely and completely made by all of them. She looked up. "I slept in your bed," she said. "Now you're all mine." For a moment, nobody moved. Then Emmett laughed, the full sound of it, surprised and delighted. Cole made a sound that was unmistakably a laugh, despite his best efforts. Wyatt looked at her with the expression he reserved for moments of things that could not be adequately expressed otherwise. And he put his arm around her fully and held on. And the mountain held them all. And below in the valley, the snow was still pulling back from the land, retreating south inch by inch as the spring pushed it, revealing the solid green ground that had been there all winter, under everything. Clara Hayes stood on her porch on her mountain with her 3 men and her deed, and her water rights, and a way station full of travelers, passing through toward somewhere safer. She had been discarded. She had walked 3 miles through a blizzard. She had learned to shoot and tie knots and read wind and cut her own bindings with a rock in the dark of an abandoned mine. She had not merely survived. She had claimed. The spring light hit the snow, and the calendula in the window threw 2 small green leaves against the glass. And somewhere down the mountain, the federal marshal's paperwork was making its way through channels that would eventually, irreversibly, put Van Sterling in a federal prison for a long time. Clara looked at the mountains. They looked back, the way mountains do indifferent to human scale, patient beyond any useful measure, enormous and entirely real. She was home. She intended to stay. There's a moment in this story that I keep coming back to. It's not the gunfight in the mine. It's not the blizzard. It's not even the vow spoken in the dark by 3 men who had every reason to turn a stranger away and chose not to. It's the morning after Clara arrives. She wakes up. She's bandaged, wrapped in buffalo robes, sitting at a table with 3 men she doesn't know. And instead of being asked how she feels, instead of being handled carefully like something broken, Cole looks at her and says, "Tell me about the contract." All of it. From the beginning. That's it. That's the whole thing. He didn't ask if she was okay. He asked her to think. He assumed she could. And that assumption, that quiet, unremarkable decision, to treat her like someone with a mind worth using, is what changes everything for Clara Vance. Not the rescue. The respect. I think that's what this story is really about. Not romance, not survival, not even justice, though it has all of those things at its core. This is a story about what happens when someone finally sees you clearly, not who you're supposed to be, not the version of you that fits the contract someone else wrote, the actual you, the one who can read a financial ledger and fire a Winchester and memorize a knot pattern without looking at her hands. Clara came west to settle a debt. She arrived with 70 cents, a soaked carpet bag, and a signature on documents she never signed. By every measure, her world used to calculate a woman's worth. She had nothing. And yet, she reorganized their winter rations. She built the legal case that brought Sterling down. She fired a warning shot 3 inches above a man's hand, not because she missed, but because she chose 3 inches. Deliberately. Precisely. On purpose. She was always that person. She just never had room to be her before. That's the first thing this story gives us. The reminder that competence doesn't announce itself. It waits. It waits for the right conditions, the right space, the right people who hand you a gun instead of a set of rules about why you shouldn't hold one. Most of us are walking around with capabilities we've never had occasion to discover, because the world we were handed was too small for them. Clara's world got blown wide open by a blizzard. Most of us need something to crack the old life before we find out what was underneath it, the whole time. The second thing is about the men. Wyatt, Cole, and Emmett are not soft men. They are not gentle in the conventional sense. They don't use careful language or perform emotional availability. What they do is harder than that and rarer. They show up. They teach. They hand over real knowledge weapons, survival skills, tactical thinking without the silent asterisk that usually comes attached, but only as much as we think you can handle. There's no asterisk. Wyatt teaches her to shoot because the situation is already dangerous, not because it might become dangerous. Cole teaches her wind reading because accuracy matters and she can develop it. Emmett teaches her the knots because he genuinely believes that knowledge moving between people is its own form of protection. This story exists within the realm of fiction, where imagination shapes reality. Any similarities to real-life individuals, organizations, or events are entirely coincidental. The author does not endorse or represent any entity through the content of this work.